People love content tools like Notion for its rich text editing experience, whether that's just adding a simple header, if I wanted to add something more visual like an image, or even if I want to use AI to continue writing this story for me. It has a lot of tools built right in to make me more productive and efficient with my writing. But what if I wanted to add this kind of thing inside of my own application, whether I'm building my own CMS, or maybe I want to add this kind of experience to my client's application? We can see how we can do this pretty easily by adding similar commands and even adding an AI feature to autocomplete what we're writing right inside of our application. To do that, we're going to use Novel, which is a WYSIWYG editor that's using TipTap and Vercel AI SDK that allows us to drop this right into our React application and easily get all these features right inside of our own app. We'll be working inside of an Astro project where we'll see how easy it is to add React components inside of our Astro app, as well as how we can create an endpoint to interface with the OpenAI SDK, which is how we'll actually feed those completion results into Novel. And then finally, to make that a little bit easier in itself, we'll use the Vercel AI SDK in order to make that a little bit more efficient. So starting off, I'm going to pick up pretty much where I left off in my last video where we built a custom CMS using AppWrite, where I have this new post page and I have some basic fields that support the different kinds of content and data that I'm storing for my blog, including a title, a slug that represents the URL for that, the content, which is currently just a plain text area field that supports Markdown through converting that into HTML, and then finally the excerpt, which is just a description on the homepage for when we list out the posts. But what I want to do is make this content field more rich, and that's where that Novel editor is going to come in. Now looking inside of the code at the new post page, we can see that we have the logic set up where we're actually submitting that form data, but ultimately what we want to look at is the HTML, where currently we have some basic form inputs, and we can see exactly what I was talking about, the text area, which is just a plain text area that isn't really doing much special. So I'm going to get started by actually adding React to my Astro application. And we can see it's as easy as running the npx astro add react command. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to run npx astro add react, which is going to go through and it's going to use the CLI in order to ask me some questions, including if I want to install some dependencies for adding React. It's going to then ask me about setting up the configuration, which it's going to completely do for us. And we can see that it's already ready to go. Now, as far as adding Novel itself, we can see that we can install that with just a simple installation command of npm install novel. So I'm going to go ahead and run npm install novel. And as soon as it's ready, we can see that we can first import it by importing the editor component from Novel. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that in. We're sticking around inside of the post new page, which is where I include that form. I'm going to go ahead and import, or rather paste in, the editor from Novel, where we can see we now have this editor component. So I'm going to scroll down in my form and I'm going to just simply replace this content field with this editor component. Now, going back to the browser and reloading the page, we can actually see that we lost that entire field. So what's going on? What's happening is by default, Astro isn't going to ship React or any of the JavaScript associated with that component for performance benefits, meaning we actually need to opt in to shipping React and the JavaScript in order to make this particular component work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify client load on this component. But now if I head to the browser and scroll down, we can see under the content field, we now have our Novel editor, including all that rich client-side interactivity, like adding a simple header, but also that AI command, which we'll set up in a minute here. But if we try to open up this new post every single time, I don't want the sample content here that I have to clear out anytime I want to write a new post. I just want this to give me a blank, fresh start. How do we set that up? If I head over to the Novel GitHub page and scroll down, we can start to see all the different options that we have for this component, including what we're going to look at is this default value prop, where we can see that it accepts a JSON content or string, but what we're going to be interested in is this default editor content, where if I look at this, we can start to see how this is set up, where what we want to do is we want to create this document type, but we want to have empty content. So basically an empty array here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the start of this document field here. And inside my application, I'm going to break this down just for some legibility so it's easier to read, but I'm going to go ahead and now specify that default value field, where inside I'm going to go ahead and paste that partially constructed object and then finishing defining it, where I have this default value that is a type of a document, and I have this content field that's just an empty array. Now, if we head back to the application, we actually see that we still have all that content. Now, what's happening here is if I open up my network tab and I go to the application tab, let me increase this a little bit so it's easier to see. What's happening by default is Novel is actually storing the content of this editor in local storage so that when you refresh the page or come back, you can persist those values to make it a little bit more of a better experience if you're trying to go in or out. Maybe you have lost connectivity so that it doesn't just clear the form every single time that you leave. We can even see here this key of novel content, where if I get rid of this, we can actually refresh the page. And now we see that we have that blank empty slate where we can start writing our commands and write it however we want to. Now we have the option of turning that local storage off, which I'm going to actually do by using the disable local storage prop. And this is probably depending on what kind of experience that you want to provide. Because if somebody's going to go to a new post, maybe write a little bit, then go away, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to persist that any single time they visit the new post page. Maybe instead you can give a warning if they're trying to leave the page after they edit, which I have a video if you want to see how to do that. But what I'm going to do is, for my workflow, I want to disable local storage. And just to be clear, if you want to have the best of both worlds, maybe you set a custom storage key so that you can control when that gets cleared based off of the user experience that you want to provide. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and disable the local storage by defining that disable local storage field, where I'm going to set that to true. So now if I try to type anything in, such as "this is a cool post," and I try to refresh the page, it's not going to persist that. But now I think it's ready for the hero of the story, where we want to add this cool AI command. But if I currently hit that, we can see that nothing's going to happen. And the reason is, if we go to the network tab and try that again, let's hit the AI, we see that we get this request to the generate endpoint, which just simply doesn't exist at this point. So the way that this is going to work, and we can head over to the documentation to kind of see, is by default, this completion API is going to hit this /API/generate endpoint, where we even get an example of this listed right at the bottom of this table, where if I open it up, we can see that we have this endpoint pretty much all set up for us, which it's going to use the OpenAI SDK. It's going to stream in those results back to the application so that we can really easily use it. So we're going to walk through how to basically set this up without some of the extra stuff that they currently have set up on it. So back inside of the code, let's start off by actually creating that endpoint that the novel editor is going to interface with. So inside of my pages directory, I'm going to create a new folder called API. And inside of API, I'm going to create a new generate .ts file, where inside of that, I'm going to export a new constant called post, which is going to be an async function, which will ultimately return our response. Now, this function is going to take an argument that we're going to destructure the request, which we're going to grab some parameters from in a second here, but this is going to be where we're going to actually do that work for using OpenAI SDK and returning the response. Now, in order to make TypeScript happy with this request object here, we can now import a type of API route. We're going to import that from Astro, where then we can define this post request as an API route. And we can see that we still get an error here, but that's because we're currently not returning our response. So we'll do that in a second. But next, we have two dependencies that we're going to want to install. One is going to be the OpenAI SDK itself, as well as Vercel's AI SDK, which just makes interfacing with the OpenAI SDK a little bit easier for our context. So we see here the OpenAI SDK as well as the AI SDK. Let's actually install them. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to run npm install OpenAI as well as just AI. And starting with OpenAI, I'm going to import the OpenAI module from OpenAI. I'm also going to create a new instance of that OpenAI module by saying constant OpenAI is equal to new OpenAI, where inside we need to specify our configuration, which is going to be our API key specifically, where I don't want to add the key directly into this endpoint, especially if I'm going to be committing this code, or just generally best practices. We don't want anybody to be able to access this API key. So let's put this in an environment variable. So inside of my .env file, I'm going to specify OpenAI API key, and that value is going to come from my OpenAI dashboard. Once you're logged into your OpenAI dashboard, we can head over to the sidebar where we have this API keys section, which is where you can generate that new secret key. And again, make sure that you don't share this key with anybody, as they can start to rack up your bill for using OpenAI to generate whatever they want. But once you have that API key filled out inside of your application, we're ready to start using that. And now we can add that value with import.meta.env.openAI API key. So now that we have this new instance set up, I'm going to head back over to that code example, and I'm going to actually copy and paste this snippet in, where if we scroll down, we can see this line, which let me make it a little bit bigger. We can see this line for OpenAI chat completions create. And this is going to be the SDK, or the method that we're going to use in order to generate that ChatGPT response, that ChatGPT-like response. So I'm going to copy that entire bit here. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my endpoint code where let's kind of walk through what's actually happening here, where we're going to use this create method. Let me get rid of my face here. We're going to use this create method. We're going to use the model of GTP 3.5 Turbo. Now, if you have access to a better model, make sure that you upgrade that to whatever it is. But then we're going to start off by sending this base message, which is essentially going to tell the AI writing assistant what it is and give us a little bit of context to help us have a better response. Now, the next one is going to be the user prompt, which is going to be sent from Novel automatically. So we don't really have to manage any of this ourselves unless we want to start to tweak how this is actually sent to kind of try to massage the AI prompting to give us better results. But to start, we just need to simply define this prompt, which is going to come in as a post body argument into the actual API request itself. Now we can grab that using our request object by specifying const, and I'm going to destructure this prompt from where I'm going to set it equal to await request.json. So whenever this payload comes through, it's going to grab this prompt because we're going to grab it directly from the JSON object that's sent to this endpoint from Novel. But as you can imagine, that's going to connect the dots for us, and it's going to be the prompt that gets sent in as our user prompt. Now, walking through some of the rest of this, I'm not going to try to show how all this works. The only one that I really want to pay attention to is stream, where that's going to mean that it's going to stream the response back for us so that we can then ultimately stream that response back to the client or the application where Novel's going to take that to display to the page. That way, instead of just coming in as one big text blob, instead of that, it's going to stream in like pretty much letter by letter, a couple letters at a time to make it look like it's kind of typing out like you would expect from ChatGPT. But if you want to learn about more of these other features, you can check out the OpenAI docs. Now from here, what we want to do is actually be able to return this response object in a way that the client will be able to read that as a stream response. And that can get a little bit tricky, but that's where we're going to use the Vercel AI SDK in order to make that a lot simpler for us. So if you remember, we already installed AI inside of our project. So all I need to do is import the OpenAI stream as well as the streaming text response from that AI package. But now that that's all imported, I can now take this response. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page or the file, and I'm going to now create a new constant of stream, which is equal to OpenAI stream, where I'm going to pass in that response as that first argument. But now finally, I can return this stream as a new streaming text response where I'm going to pass in that stream. We can also see if we scroll up to the top, post is now happy again because we are returning a valid response. So let's actually see what our new API endpoint looks like. But now when I head back to my new post editor, I'm going to paste in a little bit of snippet of text first, because if I try to continue writing on something that doesn't exist, it's basically going to say, I don't know what to write, but we're going to now try to add that AI command. And we can start to see, I'm going to get out of here, that it's going to stream in those results of the text that it just generated from the OpenAI API. If we want to try it again to see what the network request looks like, since before it was broken, we can see that once we continue writing, as it's coming in, that size is increasing because the amount of content is streaming through and it doesn't quite know what it is. So it's just going to keep pushing it through until it reaches the end. Now, one thing just to note with the Vercel AI SDK is you don't necessarily need to use Novel in order to use this. We can see even with an example here that if you want to create a similar experience by doing it yourself, they have this nice little handy hook that we can import using that. They actually support a couple different frameworks, not just React, where we can import that in, and it's going to be able to make it a lot easier for us to interface with that API endpoint right inside of our application. Now, generally speaking, this is working really well. We were able to see how easily we were able to add a rich React component into the Astro ecosystem, but we do have one big problem here. Now, the way that this is currently working, if I look inside of my new post page, is we're currently submitting this as a form request to the page so that the server sees that it's a post request. It's going to grab that form data and collect it and then send it to AppWrite. But maybe you can kind of see where I'm going with this. The page has no context of that content field because it's not actually using an input to store all that content. It's doing so inside of the client within the bounds of that React component. Now, I was thinking, what if I can, inside of this component, create a wrapper, store that inside of an input text field? And it seems like I could possibly do that, but the issue is there's going to be a max length on the input, not even considering if that is even just a hacky way to do it anyways. But an easier way to do that is, since I'm already loading React on this, I'm just going to convert this whole form into a React form where I can then just collect that data inside the client and submit that through. Now, because we know that we can add React components anywhere inside of our Astro files, I'm going to create a new component. I'm going to call that form post new.jsx, where inside I'm going to create a new constant of form post new, which is going to be my React component that is ultimately going to hold that form for me. I'm going to go ahead and export that as a default form post new. But then if we take this form and head over to our page, I'm going to now import that just like any other component. I'm going to make sure it has that right JSX extension to designate that it is a React component. And then I'm going to scroll down and I'm just going to put this right below my H1. Now, just to make sure that it's rendering so we can test something out, I'm going to add hello. But once I head back into the browser and reload the page, we can now see that I have that hello showing on the page. So we are rendering that React component. So I'm going to wave a little bit of magic here and I'm going to migrate my form here and not bore you as I copy and paste everything inside. But one thing I do want to note here is we want to make sure that, like before, we want to mark this as adding the client load so that it does load that interactivity inside the client. So to start, I have all the information that makes up the form itself, including the title, the slug, the content field that we added, as well as the excerpt. That's all moved over to React. We can see that it is loading on the page, just like we saw before. But now moving over this request logic, I want to actually move this into a submit handler for the form itself. Now, one thing that I want to make sure I do is I define this as a JSX file, and I actually want to make this a TypeScript file. So I'm going to make this TSX. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to import that statement inside of the form page itself as well. But we can see more or less we have most of the content that we had before. We're submitting that request, we're grabbing all the form data, and we're able to push that out into AppWrite. But one thing that we currently don't have set up that I wanted to walk through with you all is we need to grab that content field. So how do we actually grab the content from our editor so that we can store it and ultimately send it with that request? Now, going back to the editor documentation again, we're going to look at the different fields that we have available. And we have two. We have this on update, and we also have an on debounced update. Now, I don't want to use on update because it's going to hit every single time that editor is update. I'd rather use on debounce update, which is going to have a little bit of a period so that it's not going to just spam with API requests. So I'm going to use this on debounce update. Or if I scroll down to my content field, I'm going to add this on debounce update. And let's see, we're going to specify handle on update, where I'm going to now define this at the top of my page, function handle on update, where once this callback is fired, it's going to actually give an instance of the editor itself. Now we want to make sure this is typed. And because Novel is actually a wrapper around the TipTap editor, we're going to import that type from TipTap itself. So I'm going to import a type, and it's going to be the type of editor. But because we're already using editor, we need to specify as TipTap editor, and that's going to be from TipTap core, or rather at TipTap core. And then we have this TipTap editor, and we can define that on our editor to make sure that that's going to be available. So now that we have access to this editor instance, we can start to use it, where this editor is going to have a get HTML method, which is going to do what it sounds. It's going to return that as HTML for us. Now it also has a get JSON method as well, but we're going to store our data as HTML, as I feel like it's a little bit more practical to use instead of JSON, which kind of depends on the different product that you're using to render it back out, where HTML is pretty universally renderable. And that's what we're currently using in the database from what we walked through before. So I'm going to stick that to get HTML, and let's actually see what that looks like by console logging that out. If we head back to the browser and we start to type inside, such as this is my text, we can see that it's debounced first of all, but we get this paragraph of the HTML of this is my text. And if I add my header, such as heading 1, testing this out, we can see that we're going to periodically get those updates, and we're not going to just get an update on every single edit. So that works perfectly, but we need to ultimately store this value so that we can send it along with the form request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import use state from React, because what we're going to do is we're going to create a new instance of state called content, where we're going to specify set content so that we can ultimately use that as a state variable to store that value. So I'm going to then, instead of console logging that out, I'm going to set that content, where we need to make sure that TypeScript is happy when we're actually setting this content. So first of all, I'm going to make sure that this is going to be typed out as a string, but now we can see that we have this content field available so that if we scroll down to where we're actually sending our create document request, I can just simply pass along this content field. But now if I head back to my content editor and I go ahead and try to submit this form, we can see that we get that request. We even see that we now have our new blog post that it was automatically redirected to because it was able to successfully push that request. And if I scroll back in the network request, I'm going to go ahead and hide myself. I can look at this documents request where we can see, or can we see, yep, that I was selecting the wrong one. I'm going to look at the payload, or I'm going to look at the data where we see that HTML that's exactly sent from that TipTap or that novel editor. But now we have our Notion style editor that not only gives us easy way to add different types of content, but we can even fill that in with AI that we can really make ourselves more effective for how we're actually writing for us or maybe our clients. Next up, learn how to build that custom blog CMS with AppWrite.